Chapter 34, Friday, 1 p.m. The Confession. Remembering me, Richard turned and said, "Oh, so you are going to shoot me. Gibaldi will have wet dreams for a year." I pointed to the floor. "So it will be a win-win for at least two of us. Sit your fucking ass down." "Oh, is your leg hurting? Poor you," he replied, resting his butt against the table. I glared at him and leaned my shoulder against the shelving to take the weight off my bad leg. Richard pulled his gloves off and tossed them to the floor. Then he cocked his head and stared up at the camera connected to nothing but the server behind him. Finally, he shrugged, looked at me, and raised his eyebrows. "Did you get what you were looking for?" he asked softly. I nodded. "More than I wanted, I guess." He looked up at the ceiling. "How about you assholes?" "Well, I might as well tell it all. So don't anyone leave the room. And make sure Gibaldi doesn't hit the kill switch. You want to play games, asshole? Fine with me. So, let's see. Where do I start?" He pulled back his hair and straightened his shirt. "If you don't mind, I'll tell my side to the man with the balls to actually be here. Beats getting a crick in the neck. In fact, I'll even sit back down and give my dumbass old friend a break." When, to my surprise, he did just that. I carefully righted my chair. I kept my .45 resting on my lap. He carefully smoothed his hair and leaned against the wall, so his face naturally looked up into the camera. Many people had told Richard he should be an actor. He smiled up at me. From my angle, I could see he was developing a bald spot on his crown. I smiled back. He cleared his throat and smiled at the camera, holding the moment. I realized that he was enjoying being the center of attention. He turned his head carefully to me, keeping his hair in place, and smiled again. Showtime. "So, the question is, why did I disappear? Glad you asked. Like I said, Gabriella and I planned everything. The restaurant, the walk to the show's opening, and the mugging along the way. But we forgot one little thing. Dragna also loves openings. What are the chances he also likes restaurants that take reservations fucking months ahead? Tell me, did you even know how hard that place is to get into?" "No," I said, glancing up at the camera for his sake. "No, you didn't. And you didn't give a shit about the show. So why did Gabriella waste a couple of good tickets? You can probably guess this one. Because to her, no one would ever waste tickets that good. As far as she was concerned, it was key to the whole plan." "Yeah, she loved plays," I agreed. "Yes, she did. And you never once surprised her with one, did you? I couldn't because people would recognize us. We could only enjoy life if we brought our wallflowers with us." He shrugged an apology when I opened my mouth. He was on a roll, so I shut it. Sooner or later, we would talk about Cynthia. He didn't glance at his ceiling audience. He smiled at them and rolled his eyes as though sharing a joke. Then he turned back to me. "It turns out Dragna also had tickets to the show and reservations at the same restaurant. The feds must have been watching him. I doubt she ever saw him. I know I never did when I ducked in for a moment to make sure everything was on." He reached over and picked up the hat he had brushed off his head. He held it up to the camera. "So what was the problem? That night I wore a Gucci original cap. Like I said, we thought through all the details. They don't let muggers walk in to use the bathroom." He paused and looked at me, as if waiting for his straight man to wake up. I shrugged. I thought Gucci made expensive purses. Richard looked up at the camera, rolled his eyes, and jerked a thumb at me. "You can see why some women with style, might have a problem living with this guy. Anyway, imagine my surprise when I get a call from Dragna the next morning asking what the fuck happened to Gabriella and why the fuck are the feds talking to Nikki. Dragna, Mr. Cool, lost it." Pausing to let it sink in, Richard kept looking at the camera. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its bravado. Was he acting or remembering? I had no idea, but Richard had my complete attention. "Then he tells me he's sending a fucking car for me. It wasn't until after the bastard hung up that I figured it out. Dragna was at the restaurant, and after the shooting, you guys looked through the video and saw me with a hat on leave just before Paul and Gabriella Harding. Had to be Nikki, right? Hell, Gabriella always said we almost looked like brothers to crank my chain. You fucking morons." He frowned up at the ceiling. "My wife Cynthia was in the hospital with COVID. I couldn't even go see her. So I went to a motel in Jersey. Then, just like that, they told me she had died. I was afraid to even go to the hospital. There was no way to go to work and no reason to. The business was done. Without Mr. Gotta Be a Hero or me, no one was left to run the place. I decided, fuck it. Got into the hospital system, found some homeless guy who probably died in a hallway, and edited his records. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. Of course, I didn't remember anything about Cynthia having COVID. However, I did remember looking into her death. Seeing my face, Richard looked at me, his head cocked. I let my breath out slowly, held up a hand, and peered into the dungeon. Richard froze as I slowly stood and looked out into the gloomy room. I took a step, stopped, and turned to pick up his Glock. "That bastard," said the voice in my head. "Shut up," I replied. "What?" Richard asked. "Shut up. I thought I heard someone upstairs." "Stay here. I'm stepping out of the room to hear better," I said. I stepped around the other side of the shelving and quietly slid his Glock behind a box. Then I leaned back and forced myself to breathe. I had written off the questions I always had about Cynthia's senseless death to the chaos that reigned in New York City in the early days of COVID. Now I knew that the man inside that room was not the Richard I had known. The Richard I had known had been confident, vain, charming, self-absorbed, and careless with women. He had a streak of ruthlessness in business that we needed and used liberally. That he would kill me to save himself and Gabriella wasn't hard to accept. I might well have done the same. But Cynthia? Part of me wanted to empty my .45 into him. Another part wanted to hear the rest of the story. Or at least that was what I told myself. "That fucking chicken shit! Shoot the motherfucker!" a voice shouted in my ear. "Shut the fuck up," I replied. "I didn't say anything. What did you hear?" Richard whispered. "Probably just a fucking rat. Go ahead," I replied. He nodded and said, "Sure, why not? I'm gonna stand. I talk better when I stand. You know that, and you have the guns. Go for it," I said, leaning back against the shelving to ensure the camera could not see me. The way he stood up, brushed his hair back, and straightened his shirt, like he would a suit, told me he was doing more than explaining things. Richard was going into sales mode and enjoying it. Top salespeople are like top quarterbacks. They don't dread the game's do-or-die moments when it all comes down to making the perfect throw. They live for it. For Richard, this was a do-or-die moment. I could almost hear him tell himself that he still had the magic. He looked up at the camera and smiled his smile. "We're here because you guys were watching Frank Dragna, who had the taste to appreciate the same shows and restaurants as Gabriella. Oh, yes, and I wore a cap that night instead of a fedora. You saw a guy with longish hair, same build as Nikki, leave right before the Hardings. Seriously, you couldn't believe it was only a nightly New York City mugging? Fuck me. Anyway, so there I was, dead, homeless, no resume, no security clearances, almost no money, no prospects, and, oh yeah, definitely off all social calendars. But I did know quite a bit about money laundering." He paused, lowered his head so the camera couldn't see his face, and winked at me. Richard could be like his smile, irresistible, even though I hated myself for it. My return smile wasn't forced. When he raised his head to grin at the camera, I regretted he only had a studio audience. "Yes, I know how you feel about money launderers, Gibaldi, those scum of the earth bottom feeders. I spent the entire plane ride listening to you pontificate." He paused for effect and said apologetically, "Hey, what else was I going to do? It was the only marketable skill set I had left. I couldn't even go after any major players because they all hung out with Dragna. I had to build the business up from the bottom, from the fucking street level. I went from playing golf with congressmen to shooting pool with guys covered in tattoos who didn't finish high school. Don't get me wrong, most of those guys are not only smarter than most congressmen, they make a fuck of a lot more money." He glanced over at me, then slightly down, as if talking to himself instead of me. "You know how it feels to know that a guy like Nicky might still be looking for you and your days are numbered? I mean, street guys are crazy. One minute you are the coolest dude ever, and the next you're looking down the muzzle of a .44 because they're so fucked up they don't remember who you are. Your brains are about to be blown out of your head for everyone to look at." He looked up at the camera and shook his head. "Tell you what, though, some of those damn bars aren't that bad. I was in a lot of them. There I was, at least making a living out of sorts, when BAM! He slammed a hand down on the table so hard I jumped, and the tower server responsible for recording his act almost fell over. Richard instinctively put a hand on it to keep it upright, and, with an artist's luck, saved the record of what might have been his best performance. "Sorry, it still pisses me off. One of my clients gave me up. A little fucking turd probably gave me up to shave off a year from a drug bust that had so little product it's fucking legal in this state. Oh, and that's not the worst part. All the cops wanted was his boss, but the fucker tossed me into the deal to sweeten the pot. He rolled his eyes in disgust and continued in a quieter voice, a man trying to control himself. So I get arrested and processed, as they call it. Turns out I didn't know all I needed to know about my new line of work. I don't make bail right off. My lawyer thinks maybe they want me to roll on some of my other customers. Tells me not to let them get to me. He's seen all this before. Maybe so, but you know what he'd never seen? The U.S. fucking attorney for the New York Eastern District. He gave an appreciative nod at the camera and said, "Gotta hand it to you, Gibaldi. You started talking as you walked in, and by the time you sat down, you could have asked my lawyer to go out and get us pizza." Richard shook his head ruefully. "You had me going for a moment. Of course, you know who I am. You start out by laying out how long I can be in prison. Now, I'm doing okay because just about all my new friends have done time, so it's not like I don't know what to expect or even how to play the game. I mean, shit, that's all those morons talk about most of the time." He looked at the camera for a long time, his grin growing to a full smile. "You have no fucking idea how close you were to having me, asshole. When you dropped it on me that you knew I killed my business partner and his wife, I almost pissed myself. If you hadn't gone off on one of those long tangents, you would have seen it. But you weren't accusing me, were you? You were letting me marinate. When you finally finished, I barely managed to deny it. Which was what you wanted because it let you show me why you're famous. You actually said something like that, remember?" Richard took a deep breath and said, "You explained that guys like me do okay in the joint if we keep our mouths shut. Hell, might even be good for my business in the long run. Then you said, and I remember these exact words, 'So you'll probably be fine, unless, pay attention now, unless the word gets out that we like you for a murder beef with 2 bodies.'" He frowned, now unable to keep control. "My dumbass lawyer wakes up and says, 'Prove it. What do you have?' I bet the rest of you know exactly what your boss replied because I found out later that the prick is famous for this kind of shit. He says, 'I didn't say we were indicting him. I said he's a person of interest.' Then he looks at me and tells me that every guy I'll be doing time with would give up his mother to get out from under 2 bodies. So much for any of my customers thinking I won't roll on him." Richard laughed bitterly. "Here's the good part. Gibaldi actually changes his voice like he knows how these guys talk. He sucks at it, by the way, but I know he's right. And I tell him I can give him everything on Dragna. He wants to know every detail of Dragna's money laundering business. I think about it and say, sure, all I need is witness protection." Richard clenched his jaw and shook his head. He wasn't acting. He was reliving the meeting. "Gibaldi, you prick, you say, fuck that. You want to stay alive, first become a confidential informant, an unpaid confidential informant. Next thing I know, I'm back on the street as a goddamn snitch, expected to work my way up the ladder towards my old boss, Dragna. My handler is this skinny little turd, Willis. Hey there, Willis. I know you're there with your nose up Gibaldi's ass." So I decided to get enough money and disappear again. I had shit I could tell you guys, but I knew you bastards couldn't be trusted. Then, you know what happened? A couple of weeks ago, this YouTube video went viral with my crowd. They fucking love it. The star of the show is my old business partner, slightly worse for wear, but alive and with, you guessed it, U.S. Marshals. When I see that video, I lose it. Granted, I'm a little fucked up at the time, but come on, man. I call my handler Willis. He leaned his butt on the table, lowered his head, and took a break. From the look he hid from the camera, I knew he was disgusted with himself. He had allowed himself to go off track. When he looked up, he gave the camera an apologetic smile. "Sorry about that. You all know the rest. You put me up in a motel, guard at the door, and made sure I had beer, or what your boys call beer. I mean, at least I could sleep at night, so it wasn't all that bad. Then, the day before yesterday, you put me on a plane and wouldn't say where you were taking me. But I suspected you were running a game that involved my old buddy. By that time, I thought, what the fuck? Why not? You had him, so you always knew exactly what happened in that parking lot. You never intended to cut any kind of deal with me, did you? You just wanted to see if I could flush something out." He paused to collect his thoughts. "Okay, now don't let Gibaldi touch the controls. This is where it gets good. We land in Denver. I get in Willis's car, and we go to this hospital parking lot. I'm told to wait with the driver. Next thing I know, Gibaldi appears and talks to the driver. We go to some grocery store parking lot, and after an hour, another car pulls up and gives my driver a bag. My driver brings me here, whatever the fuck this place is. Guy at the gate lets him in with a wave." Richard paused and lowered his face as though considering how to say the next part. Again, he winked at me, and again, I grinned back. Only Richard could make the punchline to his story smile. He took a breath, nodded, and looked back up at the camera. Okay, so when we pull into the driveway, my driver hands me my Glock, the one you guys took from me a couple of weeks ago. Then he hands me gloves and a key. He tells me to go inside and wear gloves at all times. Says I'm being given the chance of a lifetime and not to blow it. Richard put his ungloved hands up and said, "Guess what? I blew it." Then he surprised me, and I saw the look I had seen hundreds of times before. The bastard was going in to close the sale. He smiled at the camera and shook a finger as though admonishing someone for their errant thoughts. It was classic Richard. But guess what, Gibaldi? Oh, and you too, Willis. I didn't learn about money laundering because Dragna is a money launderer. He isn't, and he doesn't even dabble in it. He hired me to do what my old business partner was famous for, setting honey traps for you guys to wander around in. Grinning, he almost turned to me before catching himself. Okay, maybe I wasn't the master, but I am a fucking MIT engineer. He paused and put a crooked finger to his lips as though thinking. Then he cocked his head at the camera and gave it his best serious look. So, if Dragna is not into money laundering, why make it look like he is? Good question. Maybe he doesn't want you to know why he's such a great venture capitalist. Maybe he does more than just guess the winners. How would he do that? I can do more than tell you how he does it. I can give you more evidence than you can possibly handle. He paused, out of habit, to let the buyer chime in. Then he grinned ruefully and continued. Oh, not only that, but Mr. Dragna has another line of work you never suspected. You think the guy is small potatoes. You jackasses have no idea. I have it all up in the cloud where I can pull it down for you. Gibaldi, it will make you famous. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk out of this fucking freezing room, go upstairs, put a pizza in the oven, and wait for you. If one of your boys or girls is up there, tell them to get their own. I'm fucking starved. He spun on his heels and walked directly at me. Surprised, I took a step back and raised my .45. He stopped and shook his head. You're not going to shoot me, Paul. Even if it was in you, not down here, not after being in on all that. No way. Gibaldi would make sure you get life. Come on, I told you that it was you or us, and I sure as hell never meant to kill Gabriella. Now, get the fuck out of the way. Yeah, you always had it all figured out, Richard. But Cynthia was never in the hospital, any more than you were, I said in a low voice. His eyes narrowed as he studied me. Go check the hospital records, he quietly replied. I did. And here's the thing. You stayed out of my side of the business because you're sloppy. So I checked the morgue and the ambulance records. She was picked up DOA from your fucking house the morning after you shot me. Richard always said the trick to sales is to stick with your story. Richard was a great salesman, but a terrible litterbug. Paul, everything was out of control. Let's go upstairs and you can tell Gibaldi all about it when he gets here, he said as he brushed by me. It's time, Tom said. Yes, Tom, it's time, I replied, and stepped out into the basement, not wanting to be a part of it. To my dismay, Richard followed me to the center of the room. He made a slow turn, looking at the empty shelves and up at the high ceiling. Then he looked at me. More cameras? Really, Paul? Who's Tom? I'm Tom, Tom replied. I guess I am, I said to Richard. Richard's eyes narrowed. The fuck are you talking about, Paul? What do you mean you're Tom? Tom who? Tom Horn, Tom replied. Tom Horn, I said. Okay, Paul, you're Tom Horn, Richard said, speaking slowly and carefully, his eyes drifting to the gun in my hand. Tom's hand. Later, I realized I'd known it all along, maybe from the first moment I heard myself talking to Tom. If I hadn't known, why would we have never spoken when no one else was around? Why hadn't I been answering him while in the hospital? The thing was, Tom knew. He had always known. Sorry, buddy. I knew you'd figure it out someday. Sorry it had to be now. I know you guys were friends, Tom said. Well, not exactly, but he and I did build a business, I said. Richard slid a foot backward towards the stairway and asked quietly, Are you saying that you and this Tom guy built a business? When did you do that? You know I'm not, Richard. I'm talking to Tom, not to you. Richard's foot stopped suddenly, and I looked down at the gun, which Tom had raised to chest level. Richard sucked in his cheeks and looked me in the eye the way he always did when making a sale. Paul, listen to me, okay? I know you're talking to Tom, but I don't hear Tom. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah, I understand. It's kind of obvious, right? He doesn't need to use our voice when he's talking to me, I said. But you use your voice when talking to him, Richard pointed out. Yeah, that's weird, I agreed. No, it's not weird. It's completely fucking unfair. I only get to be all me when just you are watching, like with Kaufman, Tom barked in my head. I get it. Look, we have some shit to work out. Do we have to do it now? I asked. Well, if you're talking to me, I completely agree. You and I have some shit to work out. And all I can say is how sorry I am, Paul. I told you the truth. I didn't mean to kill Gabriella. You have to believe me, man, Richard said, putting his hands together as though in prayer. I believe you, Richard. I do, I replied. He closed his eyes, lowered his head, and said, Thank you. Thank you, Paul. What I don't buy for a second is the bullshit about Cynthia. You and Gabriella would never have let her live after killing me. Hell, maybe you would have, but not Gabriella, I said. Richard raised his head and said, You don't know that, Paul. You don't know that, man. I fucking do, Tom said, and shot Richard in the chest 3 times. Thanks, I shouted over the ringing in my ears. No problem. Now can we go upstairs and work things out? You've been ignoring me for over a fucking week. Just so you know, there's no need to yell, dumbass, Tom replied.